Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 24, Industrial Unionism. The present great and ever-growing demand within the AFL for industrial unionism is not the first such demand. The unions were being enfeebled right along by the effects of craft unionism. As far back as 1903, reactionary old Sam Gompers himself said that scarcely an affiliated organization is not engaged in a desperate fight with one or more other unions, and that unless they changed their course, the unions would destroy one another. Such self-destruction, in the face of the ever-increasing attacks on wages and conditions by the employers who were steadily growing stronger, integrating mines, mills, and plants into giant holding corporations with billion-dollar financial interests, taking control of the main industries through subsidiary corporations, and seats on boards of directors. Such self-destruction was tragic, for their unions began to press hard for a change in the structure of the AFL away from the hidebound craft lines on the basis of plant and industrial unions. In the years immediately after the First World War, when the big corporations, bloated with wartime profits, began to launch plans to take away the hard-fought gains made by organized labor during the war, the craft form of unionism was more seriously than ever before felt to be a handicap for the workers. The 39th Annual Convention of the AFL in 1919 found the craft union leaders hard-pressed by the demand for industrial unionism. In the great 1919 strike wave, craft unionism was the main cause of the loss of strikes, as it was in the ensuing railway and printing trade strikes. In the 1922-24 agitation, led by the Communist Party and the Trade Union Educational League, for amalgamation of the craft unions into industrial unions, assumed large portions, especially making itself felt at the 43rd Annual Convention of the AFL in 1923. In the following years, the deadly toll of craft unionism began to be felt so sharply that no one could fail to notice it. As a result of the warfare between craft unions, the no-strike policy, the policy of playing ball with the employers, the policy of expulsion of members who had the guts to say what they felt on the union floor, the membership of the AFL declined from its highest point of 4,078,740 in 1920 to about 2.5 million in 1929. The result was that at the 1929 Annual Convention, a resolution was introduced for the appointment of a committee of 15 to formulate a plan for reducing the number of international unions and for consolidating them. The stodgy craft union leaders succeeded in voting down this expression of the sentiment of more and more of the membership. The craft union leaders reaffirmed the Scranton Declaration of 1901 as the expression of the AFL policy, on the principle of the fellow who says, "What was good enough for my great-great-grandfather is good enough for me." The fight for industrial unionism in this period was guided by the fighting left-wing groups in the various AFL unions, marshaled by the Trade Union Educational League, and by the Communists, whose aim in the trade unions was to lead the workers in the struggle for industrial unionism, amalgamation of the various crafts in each industry, rank-and-file control of the unions, a policy of real struggle against the employers for improvement of wages and conditions, instead of bootlicking on the part of the top leadership of the AFL. These fighting groups formed influential movements for amalgamation in the railroad industry, the metal trades, the building trades, etc. Later, when the fighting independent unions of the Trade Union Unity League were formed on an industrial basis, the example they set of solidarity in strike action, of rank-and-file control of the unions, of a policy of fighting the bosses for what the workers wanted instead of trying to lick their boots. This example had a great effect on the AFL membership in increasing their disgust with the results of the craft union policy. When, for the sake of the unity of the working class, the Trade Union Unity League dissolved its unions, its members entered into the unions of the AFL, and brought to the AFL membership the fruits of their experience in hard-fought struggles against the employers. Inside the AFL, they continued to be among the staunchest fighters for industrial unionism, for trade union democracy, and for a policy of struggle against the employers, instead of the collaboration of the top leaders with the employers. However, never before has the struggle for making the AFL into a powerful, unified weapon against the employers' attacks been so great as now. And here are the reasons for the intense seething going on in the AFL, with the eyes of the entire working class on the struggle for a powerful AFL based on industrial unions. For one thing, following the introduction of the NRA, the craft union policy was shown up by the great upheaval of the workers during the 1933-34 strike movement, and the great desire for unionism expressed the determination of the American working class once and for all to take a fighting stand against the repeated wage cuts, loss of conditions, layoffs, etc. This time, the workers in the big mass production industries, aluminum, automobiles, rubber, steel, for example, who had been absolutely ignored by the craft-ridden AFL leadership, determined to take matters into their own hands and organized hundreds of locals by themselves. They took part in some of the best-fought strikes ever known in American history. In most cases where the craft unions showed any interest at all in these workers, it was either to try to settle their strikes behind their backs or to come in during or after the strikes and attempt to split up these fighting industrial locals among themselves. The great fighting spirit of the workers following the NRA showed that if the AFL had had a policy of industrial unionism and a policy of struggle against the employers, from 10 to a score of millions of these workers could have been organized. So anxious were they to fight and to have the benefits of trade union protection. For another thing, company unionism began to grow by leaps and bounds under Roosevelt, and the craft union policy could do little against it in the industries where it was especially rampant: steel, radio, electrical apparatus, oil refining, chemicals, automobiles, etc. In these industries, the only AFL organizations which existed, if there were any, were a few small crafts, like bricklayers in oil refineries, or a molder's local here and there in an electrical apparatus plant, and the like. It is significant that an industrial union like the United Mine Workers of America was able to lick the company unions to a frazzle in nearly every case, organizing nearly 500,000 miners into an industrial union. Then, fascist tendencies like the Liberty League, Coughlin, Hearst, Blue, Black, Brown, and many other colored shirt movements began to raise their ugly heads, one of their avowed aims being to smash trade unionism, as the fascists had done in Germany, Italy, and Austria. What chance has a trade union movement, enfeebled and torn asunder by craft unionism and weakened by an anti-struggle policy? What chance has such a trade union movement against fascist movements which can develop into organizations as powerful as in Germany, Italy, and Austria if the working class does not unite to stop them? This fact set millions of workers thinking, and that is one of the big reasons why the demand for industrial unionism has become greater now than ever before. To the 3.5 million workers inside the AFL, and to the nearly 30 million other workers watching them in their fight for industrial unionism, it is a bread and butter proposition. The protection of powerful unions, industrial in form, democratically controlled, with a policy of fighting the bosses with a determined front, would mean not only a halt to the attacks of the employers, but a chance to take the offensive and get back what has been taken away from the workers in the shape of wage cuts, hacking away at conditions, etc. The rumbling in the ranks of the AFL that foreshadowed the present big fight for industrial unionism was felt at the 1934 convention of the AFL, held in San Francisco, the scene, a few months earlier, of the historic general strike. At that convention, 14 resolutions for industrial unionism were introduced. In an attempt to stave off the revolt they felt coming, the AFL Executive Council pretended to agree to allow the unions in at least a few of the mass production industries, automobiles and rubber, the status of international industrial unions. As for taking any steps toward industrial unionism in general, that was strictly taboo to these gentlemen. They were forced to talk glibly of organization campaigns for the steel, auto, and other mass production industries, which they later never even attempted to carry out. Instead of organizing the steel industry, They allowed the Mike Teague machine to expel those leaders and locals of the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers who wanted the campaign for organization of the steel industry carried out. Instead of organizing the mass production industries, they busied themselves after the 1934 AFL convention in scrambling to divide among the craft unions whatever organization the workers themselves had been able to bring about in the mass production industries. The Committee for Industrial Organization. The 1935 convention in Atlantic City showed that a great movement for industrial unionism had begun to sweep through the ranks of the AFL, a movement of such determination that international union leaders like John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, Charles P. Howard, president of the International Typographical Union, a craft union, Sidney Hillman, president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, David Dubinsky, president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, Thomas P. McMahon, president of the United Textile Workers, Harvey C. Fleming, president of the Oilfield, Gaswell, and Refinery Workers, Max Zaritsky, president of the Cap and Millinery Department, United Hatters, Cap and Millinery Workers Unions, Thomas H. Brown, International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Works, and other higher officials found it a good idea to become leaders of the movement for industrial unionism. Lewis and Howard led a powerful minority at the Atlantic City Convention in the fight for industrial unionism in the mass production industries. A minority report signed by 5 members of the Resolutions Committee, including Howard, Dubinsky, and Lewis, pointed out that the time has arrived when common sense demands the organization policies of the American Federation of Labor must be molded to meet present-day needs, showing that in its 55 years of existence, the AFL has enrolled only about 3.5 million members out of 39 million organizable workers. The minority resolution stated that, "We refuse to accept existing conditions as evidence that the organization policies of the American Federation of Labor have been successful." The resolution further stated that, in those industries where the work performed by a majority of the workers is of such nature that it might fall within the jurisdictional claim of more than one craft union, or no established craft union, it is declared that industrial organization is the only form that will be acceptable to the workers or adequately meet their needs. The resolution went on to show how fears of jurisdictional claims dividing the workers and preventing their unity had prevented organizations of these workers to any large extent. The minority resolution on industrial unionism was defeated at the craft-dominated AFL convention by 18,025 votes against 10,924. About a month after the convention, in November 1935, a committee for industrial organization was formed, with Lewis, Howard, Hillman, Dubinsky, McMahon, Fleming, Zaritsky, and Brown as its members, and John Brophy of the United Mine Workers as its director. Its aims were to bring the unorganized into the American Federation of Labor. By carrying on education within the Federation for Industrial Unionism in order to win over a majority, and by giving advice and help to groups of newly organized workers in mass production industry. The enemies of industrial unionism among the craft union leaders made no attempt to deny any of the arguments that crafts were disappearing, that mechanization, specialization, mass production in industry as it is today make industrial unionism necessary, that the trustification of industry has placed enormous power into the hands of the bankers and capitalists who control the major industries, and that a system of unionism which divides the workers, as does craft unionism, is ineffective against such enormous power. They are not able to deny that craft unionism has been responsible for the scabbery of union against union, for bitter fights over jurisdiction between unions, paralyzing the trade union in face of the sweeping tactics of the employers. Could only answer the arguments against craft unionism made by the industrial union advocates by re-endorsing the craft unionists' declaration at the San Francisco Convention in 1934, to the effect that experience has shown that craft unionism is most effective in protecting the welfare and advancing the interests of the workers. The craft union leaders do not come out with the real reasons why they want to hang on to the craft union system. They are afraid, for one thing, that by bringing into the AFL the masses of unorganized and unskilled workers, and through industrial unionism, they will lose control of the unions and will have to give place to more progressive leaders. They are afraid they will lose their fat salaried positions. They are afraid the nice friendships they have built up with open shop employers, bankers, and corrupt labor-hating politicians of the Republican and Democratic parties might be cut off if the unions become unified, fighting organizations. These are the reasons why they do not want to organize the millions of unorganized. Their interests are not with the working class, but on the boss's side of the fence. The AFL Executive Council has even rejected the offer of $500,000 made by the Committee for Industrial Organization to aid in organizing the steelworkers. There remained only one other answer for the craft union leaders, and that answer they gave when William Green and the Executive Council, unable to meet the strong arguments of the Committees for Industrial Organization, ordered the CIO to disband on pain of severe action. Reports are that the Executive Council will go to the length of splitting the AFL by expelling those unions which support the committee. Yes, these so-called labor leaders would split the AFL rather than adopt forms and methods which would unify the working class by enabling the AFL to organize the big majority of the unorganized. The arguments of the Lewis Industrial Union bloc are powerful, and none but the blind or those who willfully refuse to see the 30 million American workers organized can fail to support them. But arguments like these should be followed to their logical conclusion, which the Committee for Industrial Organization fails to do. It does not see that the question of industrial unionism affects not only the mass production industries, but every industry. For craft unionism has paralyzed the trade union movement in all industries. The CIO does not see that without a fighting policy by the AFL and without trade union democracy, industrial unionism would be weakened as a weapon against the employer's attacks. Trade union democracy. The Lewis Industrial Union bloc also as yet has not been able to see as far ahead as growing sections of the rank-and-file membership of the AFL as to the true implications of the fight for industrial unionism. The members of the Committee for Industrial Organization see the fight only as a question of a change in structure of the AFL, and, at that, as a change in structure only for a part of the AFL, only where the mass production industries are concerned. But they do not see, as the great masses of the rank and file do, that hand in hand with the fight for industrial unionism goes the need for genuine trade union democracy, which means the holding of conventions regularly by all the unions, freedom of discussion for all members of the unions, the democratic election of all officers, the right of all members of the unions to run for and hold offices, the right of all AFL members to hold any political belief they desire, the use of democratic methods so that the membership can decide on all questions affecting the unions they sacrifice so much for. It means cleaning house in the unions, doing away with all forms of racketeering and gangsterism, which still hold sway in many sections of the labor movement. The leaders of the industrial union bloc themselves now feel the results of high-handed bossism and lack of trade union democracy in the way in which Green and the Executive Council refuse, because they are unable, to argue the question of industrial unionism in any logical way, but resort instead to the method of autocracy, ordering the Committee for Industrial Organization to disband, resorting to threats, hinting at expulsion for those unions fighting for industrial unionism, sending letters, as Green did, to 1,354 local and federal unions directly affiliated to the AFL, to all state federations, and to 730 central labor bodies, ordering them not to have anything to do with the perfectly legal Committee for Industrial Organization. This is the same sort of tactic which is used against communists and other fighting elements in the trade unions, and which Lewis himself has used repeatedly in the UMWA, because they speak out for a policy of struggle for the unions. Because there is no real trade union democracy in the Carpenters' Union, for instance, the fighters for industrial unionism saw the spectacle of Hutchison, the leader of the Carpenters' Union, speaking and voting at the 1935 AFL Convention against industrial unionism in the name of 200,000 carpenters, even though he was speaking and voting against the real wishes of his members. The union leaders who are at the head of the fight for industrial unionism can see attempts at discussion in favor of industrial unionism being choked off by gag methods in the craft unions. There is little question but that the bulk of the craft union membership would vote overwhelmingly for industrial unionism if given the chance. If the fight for industrial unionism is to be won, it must be carried into every craft union, and the members of the craft unions must be shown a real example of genuine trade union democracy by the industrial unions which make up the Committee for Industrial Organization. If, for example, at the 1936 Convention of the Industrial United Mine Workers of America, John L. Lewis had been one of the strongest supporters of the right of the miners to elect their own district officials, what a further strengthening of the fight for industrial unionism that would have meant. John L. Lewis further weakened the fight for industrial unionism when he nominated the reactionary clique, headed by Greene, back into office at the 1935 AFL convention. As long as this clique heads the AFL, every real attempt to organize the unorganized will be seriously hampered, for the Greene clique does not want to organize the unorganized. The Committee for Industrial Organization bases its fight for industrial unions, and correctly so, on the fact that this will unify the ranks of the working class and will enable the AFL to organize the 30 million unorganized workers in the United States. But these workers, so desperate, are raring to go for a real struggle against the employers, as was shown on innumerable occasions in the past few years, when they struck without waiting for the sanction of the leading officials, when these officials refused to give such sanction, or when they struck on numberless occasions spontaneously. The Committee for Industrial Organization must come to these unorganized workers, offering them an AFL policy of class struggle, a policy of fighting for the workers' demands. By failing to see that the fight for industrial unionism is closely connected with the need of a class struggle policy, the CIO greatly weakens the struggle for industrial unionism. The masses of workers in the AFL not only want, through industrial unionism, to make the AFL a solid, united weapon against the boss's attacks, but they want an end to the policy of class collaboration, of friendship for the bosses on the part of the AFL leaders instead of a fighting policy. 1936. That is the end of Chapter 24 of American Trade Unionism. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good day.